Imagine a world where a single word, a single name, struck terror into the heart of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever known. That name was Spartacus. But to understand his story, we must first understand the world he sought to defy. It was the 1st century before the birth of Christ. The Roman Republic, though not yet an empire in name, was already an imperial power, stretching from the hills of Hispania to the deserts of Syria. Its wealth was unimaginable, its legions invincible, its culture sophisticated. But this grandeur was built on a foundation of brutal efficiency and unimaginable cruelty, and the bedrock of that foundation was slavery. Slavery was not just a part of the Roman economy, it was the engine that drove it. Millions of enslaved people toiled in fields, mines, households, and workshops. They were property, mere objects in the eyes of the law, to be used, abused, sold, or discarded at their master's whim. And in this grim hierarchy, there was no fate more terrifying than that of a gladiator. Gladiators were slaves of a special kind. They were not meant for labor. They were meant for death, bought and trained for the sole purpose of killing and dunning for the entertainment of the masses. They lived and died in the sand of the arena. Their lives were short, bloody, and performed to the roaring applause of the very society that had condemned them. They were the ultimate symbol of Roman power, the power to take a human being, strip them of their past, their identity, and even their death, and turn it into a spectacle. And into this world came a man who would take that symbol and shatter it. A man who was not born a slave, not born a gladiator, but a free man, a warrior, and a leader. His name was Spartacus. He was the gladiator who dared to challenge Rome, the slave who became a general, the man who turned an army of the oppressed into a force that shook the Republic to its very core. This is his story. Early years of Spartacus. Origin, capture, sold into slavery. Who was Spartacus before the chains? The historical records are sparse, written by Roman historians who were his enemies, so the truth is often shrouded in legend. But the most consistent account tells us he was not Roman at all. He was born among the Maiae tribe, a Thracian people who lived in the rugged, mountainous region that today is part of Bulgaria and Greece. The Thracians were known to the Romans as fierce, warlike, and independent. They were skilled horsemen and formidable warriors who fiercely resisted foreign domination. Spartacus was born into this warrior culture. From a young age, he would have been trained in the art of war, wielding the spear and sword, riding horses, and learning the tactics of his people. He knew freedom not as an abstract idea, but as the very air he breathed in the Thracian highlands. It is believed he once fought alongside the Roman legions, perhaps as an auxiliary soldier. This experience would prove crucial later. It was in the Roman army that he learned their tactics, their discipline, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. He saw the machine from the inside. But for reasons lost to history, perhaps a betrayal, a capture in a skirmish, or a debt, his destiny took a dark turn. The free Thracian warrior was captured. His world, once defined by open skies and personal honor, was now reduced to the status of property. He was stripped of his name, his past, his freedom. He was branded and chained. Spartacus was sold into the slave trade, one more body in an endless stream of human misery flowing into the heart of the Republic. His strength and martial bearing did not go unnoticed. He was not bought for a life of toil in the fields. A lanista, an owner of gladiators, named Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiadus, saw in him a prime investment. Batiadus ran a ludus, a gladiatorial school, in the city of Capua, a prosperous city not far from Rome. For a high price, Spartacus was purchased and sent to the school. The Thracian warrior was now a gladiator, condemned to die for the amusement of others. Life as a gladiator. Batiadus' school in Capua. Training. Brutal conditions. The ludus in Capua was not a school of learning, it was a factory for death. It was a fortified prison designed to break the spirit and rebuild the body into a lethal weapon. Upon arrival, Spartacus and the other new recruits were examined like livestock. They were divided by size, strength, and prior experience. Their days began before dawn. They trained for hours with heavy, blunted weapons, the sword, the shield, the net, and trident. They exercised to build muscle and endurance. They were drilled in the specific theatrical fighting styles of the arena, the murmillo, the thrax, the retiarius. They were taught not just to fight, but to die with style, to please the crowd. The conditions were deliberately harsh. The gladiators were kept in tiny, cramped cells, chained to their beds at night. The food, while hearty and designed to build strength, was a tool of control. Discipline was maintained through the whip and the rod. They were property, and they were reminded of it every second of every day. Yet, in this hell, a strange bond formed among the men. They came from all corners of the known world. Thracians like Spartacus, Gauls, Germans, Syrians, Africans. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, but they shared a common fate. They were all dead men walking. This shared despair, this brotherhood of the condemned, became the crucible in which rebellion was forged. Spartacus, with his innate leadership, his military experience, and his burning spirit that refused to be broken, naturally emerged as a figure of respect. He wasn't just a skilled fighter, he was a thinker, a strategist. He saw the Roman system for what it was, and he began to whisper to his companions, to Crixus the Gaul, to Oenomaus the German, and to others. He spoke not of surviving the arena, but of escaping it. He spoke not of winning the crowd's favor, but of winning their freedom. The plan was audacious, incredibly dangerous, but what did they have to lose? A life in chains? A death on the sand? The risk of a bloody end in escape was preferable to the certainty of a bloody end in the arena. The seed of rebellion was planted. It needed only an opportunity to grow. The escape. How he and his comrades broke free and took up arms. The opportunity came in the spring of 73 BC. The plot was simple in concept, but perilous in execution. The gladiators, using tools from the kitchen, planned to break out of their cells and fight their way past the guards. They had no grand army, no sophisticated weapons, only their training, their desperation, and their will to be free. Something went wrong. Perhaps they were discovered, or perhaps the chaos began prematurely, but what started as a covert escape erupted into a violent riot. Spartacus and about 70 of his comrades seized knives, spits, and cleavers from the ludus's kitchen. They burst into the corridors, overwhelming the surprised guards. They fought not with the refined techniques of the arena, but with the raw, desperate fury of men fighting for their lives. They broke through the gates of the ludus and into the streets of Capua. They were free, but they were far from safe. They were a small band of armed fugitives in the heart of Roman territory. Their first priority was to put distance between themselves and the inevitable Roman response. They fled to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, which was then not a famous volcano, but a quiet, heavily wooded mountain. Its caves and rugged terrain provided a perfect natural fortress. Here they could breathe, plan, and gather strength. They began to raid the surrounding countryside, not for pillage, but for supplies and weapons. They targeted the villas of the wealthy, seizing swords, armor, and food. And with every raid, their ranks swelled. The news of the Gladiator rebellion spread like wildfire through the slave population of Italy. Field slaves, herdsmen, miners, all who heard the call saw a flicker of hope. They abandoned their masters and fled to Vesuvius to join Spartacus. What began as 70 desperate gladiators was quickly becoming an army of the oppressed. First success, the defeat of Roman detachments, the growth of his army. Rome, of course, did not ignore this threat. However, they severely underestimated it. The Senate did not see a war, they saw a simple problem of banditry, a police action. They dispatched a force of 3,000 men under the command of Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. His strategy was to contain the problem. He marched to Vesuvius and, finding the main path up the mountain guarded by the rebels, decided to blockade the only known trail. He assumed he could simply starve them out. It was a classic Roman tactic, and it was a catastrophic mistake. It revealed the Roman commander's utter lack of respect for the ingenuity of his enemy. Spartacus, the former auxiliary soldier who had studied Roman ways, saw the weakness in Glaber's plan immediately. The Romans, confident in their siege, grew complacent. Meanwhile, Spartacus and his men gathered wild vines from the summit of the mountain. Under cover of darkness, they used these sturdy vines to rappel down a steep, unguarded cliff face on the other side of the mountain. They moved silently, flanking the entire Roman force camped below. At dawn, they launched a surprise attack from the rear. The Roman camp was thrown into utter chaos. Soldiers, who had expected to be besiegers, were now the besieged. They were unprepared and outmaneuvered. The rebel slaves, fighting with the fury of men who knew capture meant crucifixion, cut the Roman militia to pieces. Glaber's force was annihilated. The rebels captured their weapons, their armor, their standards. It was not a skirmish, it was a stunning, complete victory. The message was sent, and it echoed across Italy. A Roman army could be defeated. The floodgates opened. Slaves from all over the south flocked to Spartacus's banner. His army swelled into the tens of thousands. Rome, now deeply alarmed, sent a second expedition under Praetor Publius Varinius. Spartacus outmaneuvered, ambushed, and humiliated Varinius as well, even capturing the praetor's own horse and personal belongings. Spartacus was no longer a bandit leader. He was the commander of a formidable army, and Rome was finally beginning to understand the scale of the threat. The army of the free, discipline, organization, Spartacus's strategy. This growing multitude was not a mindless mob. This is where Spartacus's genius truly shone. He faced an impossible task: to transform a vast, disorganized crowd of slaves from dozens of different nations and languages into a cohesive fighting force, and he succeeded. He imposed strict discipline, learned from his time with the Romans. He organized his army not by tribe, but into structured units with clear chains of command. He drilled them relentlessly. He used the weapons and armor captured by the Romans to equip his troops, creating a force that began to look and fight like a legitimate Roman army. But there was a crucial difference. This was an army of the free. Spartacus shared plunder equally. He forbade the holding of gold and silver by individuals, promoting a sense of common cause. He established a council of his most trusted commanders, like Crixus and Oenomaus, to make key decisions. He was not a dictator. He was a leader chosen by the will of the people he led. His strategy was clear and pragmatic. He knew his army, however large, could not ultimately defeat the limitless resources of Rome on its home soil. His goal was not to conquer Rome, but to escape it. He aimed to lead his people out of Italy, back to their homelands. For the Gauls and Germans under Crixus, this meant crossing the Alps to the north. For Thracians like himself, it meant crossing the Adriatic Sea to the east. Throughout 72 BC, the slave army became an unstoppable force. They wintered in the south of Italy, systematically looting the rich cities of Thurii and Metapontum to supply themselves. They defeated 2 more Roman armies, each larger than the last, commanded by consuls, the highest elected officials in Rome. The unthinkable was happening. The heartland of the Republic was being terrorized by its own slaves, and the legion seemed powerless to stop them. Major victories, the defeat of the legions, shock in Rome. The victories of Spartacus in 72 BC sent seismic shocks through the Roman political system. The consuls, Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, were given command. They devised a strategy to trap the slave army between their two forces and crush it. But Spartacus was a master of maneuver. He defeated Lentulus's army first, then turned and routed the forces of Gellius. The pinnacle of this success was the defeat of the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, who tried to block their path at the river Po with an army of 10,000 men. Spartacus smashed his force, capturing his camp and opening the road to the Alps. Freedom was for the first time a tangible reality. The path across the mountains lay open. In Rome, panic turned to sheer terror. The name Spartacus was spoken not with contempt, but with dread. The rebellion was no longer an embarrassment, it was an existential threat. The economic system was in chaos as slaves everywhere grew restless. The prestige of the legions was in tatters. No consul, no praetor wanted the command. The situation demanded a leader of singular ruthlessness, determination, and military skill. The Senate turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the richest man in Rome, a man of immense ambition and political cunning. He had served under Sulla and understood war. He demanded and was granted the supreme command with the special title of praetor, and not one, but 6 new legions were placed at his disposal. To this he added the remnants of the consular armies, creating a force of over 40,000 professional soldiers. Crassus was not going to chase Spartacus, he was going to systematically hunt him down and eradicate him. Major victories, the defeat of the legions, shock in Rome. The victories of Spartacus in 72 BC sent seismic shocks through the Roman political system. The consuls, Gellius Publicola and Gaius Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, were given command. They devised a strategy to trap the slave army between their two forces and crush it. But Spartacus was a master of maneuver. He defeated Lentulus's army first, then turned and routed the forces of Gellius. The pinnacle of this success was the defeat of the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, who tried to block their path at the river Po with an army of 10,000 men. Spartacus smashed his force, capturing his camp and opening the road to the Alps. Freedom was, for the first time, a tangible reality. The path across the mountains lay open. In Rome, panic turned to sheer terror. The name Spartacus was spoken not with contempt, but with dread. The rebellion was no longer an embarrassment, it was an existential threat. The economic system was in chaos as slaves everywhere grew restless. The prestige of the legions was in tatters. No consul, no praetor wanted the command. The situation demanded a leader of singular ruthlessness, determination, and military skill. The Senate turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the richest man in Rome, a man of immense ambition and political cunning. He had served under Sulla and understood war. He demanded and was granted the supreme command with the special title of praetor, and not 1 but 6 new legions were placed at his disposal. To this he added the remnants of the consular armies, creating a force of over 40,000 professional soldiers. Crassus was not going to chase Spartacus, he was going to systematically hunt him down and eradicate him. Hope for freedom, plans to cross the Alps, disagreements in the ranks. At this moment of supreme victory, with the Alps within sight, tragedy struck from within. The slave army was fracturing. The stunning successes had gone to the heads of many. Why flee over treacherous mountains to an uncertain future when they could stay and plunder the rich lands of Italy? A major disagreement erupted between Spartacus and his commanders, particularly Crixus and the large contingent of Gauls and Germans. Spartacus remained steadfast. Their goal was freedom, not vengeance. To stay was to invite the full, focused wrath of Rome, and that was a war they could not win. But Crixus and perhaps 30,000 others refused to follow. They broke away from the main force, choosing to stay in the south to raid and fight on their own terms. It was a catastrophic decision. Crassus, a shrewd strategist, saw his opportunity. He sent his legate, Mummius, with 2 legions to harass Spartacus's main force, but ordered him not to engage fully. Mummius disobeyed, attacked, and was soundly defeated. While this was another victory for the rebels, it gave Crassus the pretext he needed to restore discipline in his own ranks. He revived the ancient and brutal punishment of decimation for the units that had fled. 1 in 10 soldiers were chosen by lot and clubbed to death by their own comrades. The message was clear: failure would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, Crassus turned his full attention to the separated forces of Crixus. Near Mount Garganus in Apulia, the Roman legions found the breakaway group. Outnumbered and isolated, the rebels fought with desperate bravery, but were utterly annihilated. Crixus himself fell in the battle. When news reached Spartacus that Crixus was dead and his army destroyed, he was said to have been filled with grim sorrow. To honor his fallen comrade, he staged a grim mockery of Roman funeral games, forcing hundreds of Roman prisoners of war to fight to the death in gladiatorial combat. The symbolism was powerful and bitter. The slaves were now the masters of the spectacle. The collapse of hope, return to Italy, betrayals, mistakes. The death of Crixus changed everything. The path to the Alps was still open, but the strategic situation had darkened. Crassus's rebuilt and terrified army was now moving to block him. Furthermore, Spartacus may have felt he could not abandon the remaining rebels in the south. For reasons that remain debated by historians, he made a fateful decision. He turned his army around and marched back south into the heart of the Roman trap. It was a move born of loyalty, perhaps, or a lack of viable options, but it sealed his fate. He was now trapped in the Italian peninsula. Crassus, a methodical engineer as much as a general, decided to end the war not with a single great battle, but with a siege. He used his massive army to build a formidable wall across the toe of Italy, the Rhetian Peninsula. It was a ditch and palisade over 35 miles long, cutting off the rebels from the rest of Italy. Crassus meant to starve them into submission. For a time it worked. The rebels were confined, but Spartacus, ever resourceful, waited for a stormy winter night. He ordered his men to fill a section of the ditch with earth, wood, and the bodies of dead prisoners and horses they had killed. In the driving wind and rain, they forced their way through a section of the Roman lines and broke out once more. But the end was near. The rebellion was running out of space and time. 2 more Roman armies were now converging on Italy. Pompey the Great, fresh from crushing a rebellion in Spain, was racing from the north. Another force was landing from Macedonia in the east. Spartacus's only hope was to defeat Crassus utterly and quickly before these other armies could arrive and seal his doom. He turned to face Crassus. The 2 armies moved into position for a final, decisive confrontation. The final battle. The fight with Crassus's army. The death of Spartacus. The final battle took place in 71 BC in the region of Lucania, near the river Silarus. The details are hazy, lost to the fog of war and biased histories. But we know that on the morning of the battle, Spartacus was given a bad omen. His horse was brought to him, and he drew his sword and killed it. He told his men, "If we win, I shall have a great many better horses. If we lose, I shall not need one." Then he did something extraordinary. he pushed through the ranks to face the Roman commander, Crassus. He wasn't trying to negotiate. He was trying to settle the war with single combat. It was a challenge from a warrior king, a throwback to his Thracian roots. Crassus, the politician and businessman, naturally refused. The fate of thousands would be decided by thousands. The slave army, knowing this was their last stand, fought with a ferocity that stunned the Roman legions. They had nothing left to lose. Spartacus himself fought like a man possessed, cutting his way through the Roman lines, trying desperately to reach Crassus himself. He cut down 2 centurions who tried to stop him. But individual bravery was no match for Roman discipline and numbers. The rebels were slowly pushed back, surrounded, and cut down. In the final melee, Spartacus was surrounded. He fought on until he was wounded in the leg by a spear and forced to one knee. Even then, he continued to fight, holding his shield and sword until he was overwhelmed and cut down. His body was never officially identified. He vanished into the carnage of his final battlefield, becoming a legend in death as he had been in life.
After death, the consequences of the rebellion, his legacy. The immediate aftermath was a horrifying testament to Roman vengeance. Crassus captured over 6,000 survivors. To send a message that would echo through the centuries, he crucified them all along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. For miles, the rotting bodies lined the road, a gruesome warning to any slave who ever thought of freedom. Pompey arrived just in time to mop up a few fleeing stragglers, and then, to Crassus's immense fury, claimed credit in Rome for finishing the war. This rivalry between the two men would soon push them together into a political alliance, the First Triumvirate, that would eventually destroy the Roman Republic itself. Thus, indirectly, Spartacus's rebellion helped topple the very system it had challenged. In the short term, the rebellion failed. Slavery was not abolished. It was reinforced with even more brutal laws. The dream of freedom died on the crosses of the Appian Way. But the story of Spartacus did not die. It became a powerful myth. For the oppressed throughout history, he became a symbol of the fight for freedom against impossible odds. He was the man who proved that the mighty could be humbled, that the system was not invincible. His story has been told and retold for over 2,000 years, in books, in films, in political movements. He is remembered not for the battles he won, but for the cause he represented, the inherent and unbreakable desire of every human being to be free. He was a gladiator, a slave, a general, and a leader.
Like and subscribe for more. Thank you for listening.